welcome to the 14th episode of Mixed Media Reviews, since the bonus episode was technically the 13th. But anyway, my name is Kelsey, and today I'll be talking about a book. This week's book is Lore by Alexander Bracken. This is yet another book that has been very popular on the Bookstagram, and of course that made me very hesitant. But I really enjoyed Bracken's Darkest Minds series, so I thought I'd, give it a go. I was also vaguely aware that this was like Greek mythology, mostly from the cover, and also me thinking that lore was as in like Greek lore, not a person's name, because that's not a name that's made up. And even though it did turn out to be a name, it still had some Greek mythology, so I was half right. But the cover is pretty cool. It has a white marble statue of Medusa in front of a white background. Snakes swarm on her head and frame her face. Gold letters spell out lore in all caps, with a realistic eye of golden brown peeking through the O. The bottom reads, "Bind your fate to mine." This episode, like usual, is going to have some minor spoilers, but I won't give too much away, like the ending or any of the big plot points, besides what's already said in the summary. Speaking of summary, this is it. Every 7 years, the Aegon begins. As punishment for a past rebellion, 9 Greek gods are forced to walk the earth as mortals, hunted by the descendants of ancient bloodlines, all eager to kill a god and seize their divining power and immortality. Long ago, Lore Perseus fled that brutal world in the wake of her family's sadistic murder by a rival line, turning her back on the hunt's promises of eternal glory. For years, she's pushed away any thought of revenge against the man, now a god, responsible for their deaths. Yet as the next hunt dawns over New York City, 2 participants seek out her help. Castor, a childhood friend of Lore believed long dead, and a gravely wounded Athena, among the last of the original gods. The goddess offers an alliance against their mutual enemy and, at last, a way for Lore to leave the Aegon behind forever. But Lore's decision to bind her fate to Athena's and rejoin the hunt will come at a deadly cost, and still may not be enough to stop the rise of a new god with the power to bring humanity to its knees. So first things first, I love a book with a map. Anytime the inside of the cover has a map or a floor plan or some kind of visual, I love it. And this book not only has a map of New York City, it also has some of the important buildings popping up in like a 3D effect. And I just love it so freaking much. I loved referencing it every single time they mentioned a building that they were going to. And can we get more books to do this? Especially fantasy or science fiction ones when there's a new world. I love it. She also included like the gods and the lines and the families and stuff like that, which I also really like because I like having a visual representation of everything and something to kind of reference if I forget a character's name or something, which is something that I really loved that Pierce Brown did in the Red Rising series. It makes it very helpful for someone who forgets everything constantly, like a goldfish. Overall, I really enjoyed the story of this book. I thought it was a fairly original adaptation of the gods of Greek mythology, and it kept reminding me of Percy Jackson, which I loved. Though this isn't really like Percy Jackson, where the gods turn out to be real. It's kind of more like a Hunger Games version of it, where there's a fight to the death every 7 years instead. I also like that the gods are mostly jerks, because that just seems like it would be accurate. Her world building was pretty solid, and I loved when it blended seamlessly with our world. I thought Lore was a pretty good female lead. She was strong, she was emotional at times, and she was sometimes smart. I mean, sometimes she is. I'll talk a bit more about that later in the critiques portion, but I did think she was a fairly believable character, as were the rest of the group that she kind of was with, as well as like the villains and all the other kind of side characters that were in the books. There's not more than one. Anyway, I liked all of the characters, and I think Bracken did a good job of having a diverse cast without it feeling forced. There was a little bit of romance in the book, but it wasn't the main focal point, which is exactly how I like my romantic elements. Like in the Hunger Games, there is some romance, sure, but the main drive was the games, or President Snow, or, Katniss being the revolutionary. So I do enjoy romance in my books, but I hate when that becomes the focal point. Especially if it's not a romance novel, and I typically don't read romance novels anyway, so yeah. There was a quote that I really liked from Lore's father. He said, "Sometimes the braver thing is to accept help when you've been made to believe you shouldn't need it." And in today's society, we put so much emphasis on being strong and independent that it can be really hard to ask for help when we need it. I know it's something that I struggle with myself, so this quote really resonated with me, that it takes courage to ask for help, especially in a society where we're always told we shouldn't have to, or that we should be able to, stand up for ourselves or pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. So yeah, I thought that was a really nice line that she remembered her father saying to her. There was this time where Lore goes to put someone else's earpiece in her ear, and I was like, no, at first. But then Bracken makes a point to write that she cleans it off before putting it in her ear, and I was very thankful. I mean, it's still gross, but I appreciate that she cleans it, and that the author, makes it a point to bring it up that she cleans it, because sometimes you are in a situation where you have to put the bad guy's earpiece in your own ear, and the best thing that you can do is attempt to clean it and then internally cringe while you put it in your own ear, and then just forget that it ever happened, I guess. But yeah, I thought that was pretty funny. I think a lot of what happens in the books follows pretty well. There's nothing that I can think of that was totally out of nowhere or that didn't seem to make sense within the context of the story. There are also some great plot points that I think she did really well. Slightly spoilery, and you can skip to the next section if you prefer no spoilers, because I'm about to be done here. But what she did when she was connecting Lore to the afterlife, I thought that was pretty cool. When she was underground by herself, and the people in the afterlife, which I won't name names, kind of helps her to get to a location where she can be saved. And then as well, when she was down in the subway tunnels towards the end of the story, when she saw the shadows of the people around her that were kind of helping her to stay strong in the situation, I thought that was really beautiful. And I really liked the way in which she wrote and described the visuals of that. It was pretty neat. Another slightly spoilery thing, and the last thing I'm going to talk about, is the sacrifice. Not really in details about what it is, just in case, but more in just that it's a thing that's in the book, and if you don't know, that's kind of a spoiler in itself. I did have an inkling about what it was, that it was going to be some kind of sacrifice, and it was sort of along the same lines of what had happened, but I thought what it ended up being was really great, and again, it made sense for the book. I also liked the big twist at the end, when she finds out exactly how her family was murdered, and the way that they set that up. And by they, I mean Alexandra Bracken. But yeah, I thought it was really well done. So, critiques. I'm going to say this every single time. I wish I didn't have to say it every single time, and I wish there didn't have to be so many times where I had to say it. But concrete and cement are not interchangeable. And the more you say things are cement, the more I hate it and get irrationally mad. Concrete is a material. Cement is an ingredient in concrete. Concrete is made of Portland cement, an aggregate like rock, sand, and then water. Very specific amounts of each of those things, and that creates concrete. The sidewalk is concrete. It's not cement. The building has concrete walls, not cement walls. It'd be like calling a cake flour. Just because that's a major ingredient does not mean that it's cake. And I can hear you British people now being like, well, you guys call the sponge cake and also all of the cake. But it's not like that, so just shut up. But yeah, cement and concrete, two different things. Another thing was that Lore, as well as a lot of the other characters, seemed to be smart when the story needed it, and also dumb when it was needed. To me, it didn't seem like they were very consistent, and even Athena seemed to kind of be slow at times. Oh, my cat just jumped up here, so he'll probably be hunting for my water cup. But yeah, even Athena seemed kind of slow, and that could have been intentional. But the way the other characters seemed inconsistent, I don't know if I would say that it was intentional. But maybe it was. Who knows? There were a few things that Bracken did that annoyed me a bit. She kept interrupting the dialogue with dialogue tags and like actions and things. Sometimes it could be okay, but most of the time it did not flow very well. One time where it kind of worked is when she wrote, "Stop. Lore forced them both to the ground with a hard drop. It." Written down, it kind of makes sense. She's pushing them down between her words, but you could also just write, "Lore forced them both to the ground with a hard drop. Stop it." You don't really need the interruption to get the point across that she's saying it while pushing them down, unless it's really important to know the exact timing. Another few examples that it didn't work well was when she put, "If we could have a prophecy, my lord," Philip began, turning to Castor, "we might be able to anticipate." And then he goes on about stuff. And another example is, "If you didn't come to help me," Castor said slowly, "then what are you doing here?" And the final one that I'll give is, "And if you're so sure that Hermes hid something here, in a place that's meaningful to you," Miles continued, "it means you were in contact with," and then he comes to a conclusion. So these are all sprinkled throughout and mostly unnecessary. You don't need to interrupt the dialogue with an action or to show how the person is speaking. You can do that before or after. Constantly interrupting the dialogue just ruins the flow of the scene, and it can lessen the impact of the words being spoken. Of course, this isn't absolute. You could have a villain making a statement, then interrupt it with a killing blow to a side character, and that could be really impactful. But that should be a very controlled use to magnify the impact, not used all over the place and willy-nilly. I think because she kept doing it, it made it less impactful every single time, if that makes sense. Like, if it had only been a couple, I probably wouldn't even really picked up on it. But because it was so frequently, like, I went to look back and I was just looking at random pages to find these examples. And it didn't take very long to find them because she used them so frequently. Another thing that she did was not say all the time, which I realize I do. But she also fell victim to the, what I call the New York City trope, which is the one where if it takes place in New York City, the author is constantly naming streets and locations so people know for sure that it's New York City and they totally know their way around New York City and they've been to the city and like we get it. It's fine to name drop some locations or even mention a street name here and there. Like I said earlier, I really liked going back and referencing the map that was in the book, seeing the locations. But really, if it's vital to the story, that's when we need to hear those names and those locations. But I swear, these New York City books just throw them out so casually so they can sound like they know the city. And maybe it's because I've never been, so it really doesn't matter to me that they're on whatever street they're on. And maybe if I read a book that took place where I'm from, it would be exciting to hear those street names or locations. But I don't know. I'm still leaving this in the critiques, firmly in the critiques section. You may remember that I have said before that I'm a very visual reader, meaning that when I read, I kind of imagine it in my head and I'm kind of watching it play out. So when an author writes something like they sat down and then they're talking, but then all of a sudden now they're walking somewhere, but they didn't mention getting up or something, it can kind of sometimes mess with my brain, or if so-and-so were standing next to each other, but now all of a sudden they're not standing next to each other and it wasn't mentioned that they walk away. Things like that can make it kind of feel disjointed in my brain, and it tends to make me like pull out of the story and then rearrange the scene and then jump back in, if that makes any sense. So there were a few times where I wasn't quite following how she was laying out the environment, and it felt like things were forgotten or maybe glossed over. One example is that at one point they disguise their spear weapon things to look like mops. But then she mentioned the cab driver giving them a weird look, but I'm sure it's not totally out of the ordinary for two people to get into a cab with cleaning supplies. I mean, this is New York, right? And as every New York City book likes to remind us, no one gives weird things a second look there. So why would the cab driver give a weird look? I mean, if they had weapons, I could see the weird look. I don't know. Very confused with that part. Another thing that she did, which is sort of in the same realm of the whole visual reading disjointedness, is that a word? So there's this point where Lore says she's going to go shower and then take a nap, but she immediately goes upstairs and takes a nap, which, okay, maybe she was too tired and decided to nap first. But then when she wakes up, she doesn't shower. Then she talks with another character who is literally on his way to going to shower, and she still doesn't shower. So obviously they have time before they have to leave because he's in there showering. But she never showers. So why did she mention taking a shower if she didn't even take a shower? I was very confused, and it made me very angry. I mean, not really, but I mean, like, if you're going to have your character announce that they're going to go do something and then never do it, why? Why do that to me? Her writing style is pretty good, despite the things I said. Overall, I did enjoy the way she built the world and her characters, but there were times that it was a bit overly flowery. That's hard to say. There was a time when her language is a bit overly flowery with too many metaphors, and her dialogue tags would get too descriptive to the point that it would take me out, and then they were way too often too. You don't have to end the majority of your dialogue with he said, she said, they said, like I've said before. You can just have the character speak, and then that is them saying what they said. You use so-and-so said to make sure it's clear, but if there's only like two people going back and forth, then you don't have to do it every time. And also, sometimes you don't have to say that somebody yelled. You can just have an exclamation point, or if they said something venomously, you could just, make note of that in the words that they use to speak to somebody. So that was a little too much. That could have been tweaked in editing, which brings me to the next point, was that there were a few editing mistakes. Not a ton, but enough for me to notice it. Would I recommend Lore? I would absolutely recommend reading Lore by Alexandra Bracken. Like I said, this is Percy Jackson meets The Hunger Games. It's action-packed and full of adventure with a sprinkling of romance, which is just the right amount. It was a really fun read, and to be honest, I enjoyed it immensely. I am a sucker for YA fantasies, especially where there's a character with knowledge about something and has to explain to their best friend all the stuff that they had no idea existed. Looking at you, Shang-Chi, even though that isn't exactly YA, but still, whatever. Well, and there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Lore by Alexandra Bracken. Thank you so much for joining me today. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Mixed Media Reviews, and you can also find me anywhere you find your podcasts, as long as that is, Anchor, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Breaker, or Radio Public. And I'm now on CastBox and Pocket Casts. Those are hard to say. And I may be on Overcast because I'm on Apple Podcasts, but I can't check Overcast because I don't own any Apple products, and so I can't download the app, and you can't create an account unless you have the app. Anywho, please join me next week where I will finally be reviewing the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. Airbender. It's fine. Join me next week. I'll be talking about that, and I may throw in Legend of Korra, but it will depend on the time. So we'll see. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.